My aunt told me the story. We're actually related by marriage, so she has a whole new set of Skinwalker stories that I would like to share with you. This story took place when she was a child. My aunt's family lived in a community about 20 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico. The area is far different from where I live. My house is surrounded by desert, and you don't really see trees until you move into the canyon. Bread Springs is a forested area, and it's where our story takes place. Like many people on the res, my aunt's family didn't have running water or electricity. In order to get some, they would have to drive into town and pull water back in large containers. The containers are huge and easily fit in the bed of a truck. Her family would place 2 containers on a long flatbed trailer to make the best of each trip. So her family went into Gallup, filled up the containers, and went around town doing other types of business. Back then, seatbelt laws weren't so strict, and so my aunt and her siblings sat in the bed of the truck as they went around town. It began to get dark, and so the family started going back home. Most roads weren't paved, and so they had to drive very carefully because of the trailer as well. The lights of town faded away in the distance, and soon the vehicle was surrounded by darkness. They drove and the kids sat in the back and talked among themselves. However, that was until my aunt noticed something. There was a figure crouched by the furthest water container on the flat bed. The truck wasn't barreling down the road, but it was going at a speed that would be impossible for anyone to run and jump on. My aunt nudged her siblings, and they all paused to look at the dark figure. They all got silent and squinted their eyes to look. It was too dark to really make anything out, so they ignored her and continued to talk. My aunt kept her eye on the figure and pulled hard on the sleeve of her brother when this thing began to crawl over one of the water containers. The kids all stopped and watched in fear as the figure began to move carefully over the second container. My aunt said that the figure looked like a person. However, its limbs were abnormally long. With these long limbs, it was pulling its body closer to the kids. At this point, they began to scream and cry. They banged on the window of the truck. At this time, the creature was reaching for the tailgate of the truck. Due to the huge commotion that was now going on in the bed of the truck, the driver slammed on the brakes. The creature hit the tailgate and fell down in between the truck and the trailer. The driver rolled down the window and asked what was going on. The kids screamed at the driver to go. They weren't sure they were safe until they saw that the trailer moved up and down as if it ran over something large. When my aunt told me the story, I sat in disbelief. She told me she was uncomfortable when it was crawling on the trailer, but true fear rang through her body when she saw its eyes. I asked her what she meant. She said that they were like teddy bear eyes. I didn't quite understand what that meant until I pressed further. She said that its eyes were shiny. When you shine the light in the eyes of an animal, they reflect back. The brake lights were shining, and whatever they saw that night had eyes that were glowing back. I want to remain anonymous due to the nature of the story. See, I was in the Marines. I wasn't in any special forces or anything unique per se. I was just a regular rank and file Marine. I was stationed at the 29 Palms Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Training Center. I wasn't the only one who had seen or experienced things in the training grounds and surrounding areas. I was told to keep my mouth shut, but I'm gonna die soon anyways. So even if they do come for me, it's not gonna make a difference. It was early April, so the weather wasn't too bad. It wasn't hot during the day, and it wasn't cold at night. I always enjoyed doing field ops during that time of the year. I got away from all the dumb shit that we had to do day in and day out back on the main site, and I was always left to my own when I was out in the field. So late one night, me and a buddy of mine are doing fire watch for our section of the rest area. We had our rifles, helmets with our night vision goggles mounted on the front, and rifles with us. We also had 4 mags and live ammo. That night, an artillery group was doing night practice, so you'll hear the echo of the guns followed by the sound of the shells hitting the ground and exploding. Me and my friend were talking about just random crap when I flipped down my night vision goggles and saw movement out in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the green tint of the goggles fucking with my head, but then I saw it again. I tapped my buddy and asked if he was seeing this. He flipped down his night vision goggles too, and he nodded. "Yeah, but what is it? A coyote?" he asked. "No, man. It's too big to be a coyote. Besides, it looks like it's running around on 2 legs," I said back to him. That's when he tapped me and pointed out into the dark. "Hey, there's more than one, bro," he said. I looked to where he was pointing, and that's when I saw 4 or 5 other figures moving around in the dark. These things weren't that big. I would say maybe about 5'5", give or take. They also appeared to be very strong and built with massive arms and leg muscles. They were dark. They had big dark eyes and no nose to speak of. Their mouth was wide and filled with razor-sharp teeth. They walked around hunched over with their arms dangling by their sides. Their arms themselves were massive. They were running at crazy speeds, occasionally running on all 4s. They had 4 fingers on each hand, and the claws were long and sharp. It was like they had daggers for their nails. "Dude, I think they're getting closer." I nodded. "Yeah, I'm gonna go get the corporal up." He nodded, and I raced over to where our corporal was sleeping at and shook him awake. "There's something out there. You need to come take a look." He cursed under his breath and sat up. "This better be good," he said as he sat up. And then, that's when we heard gunfire. I raced back to my buddy who was shooting in the dark. I looked and I saw these creatures out in the dark, maybe 400 to 300 yards away. As other Marines had woken up to the sound of my buddy shooting, the officer in charge came running up asking what the fuck was going on. When we pointed to the creatures, he froze in place. About this time we heard tons of gunfire suddenly erupt from another unit who was conducting training as well. When I looked back at where these things were, they were no longer there. Instead, they were running on all 4s, directly at us. I raised my rifle and began to fire at them, as those with guns and ammo joined in, and the others who didn't ran back to get theirs. I lined up my sights with the closest one and began to fire into it. I saw chunks of its flesh get ripped off when I hit it, and it tumbled down. But without missing a beat, it regained its balance and kept running at us. At this point, I knew our rifles were useless, but I wasn't gonna leave my buddy. That's when I heard the officer in charge yelling for us to get back in the trucks and get the fuck out of there and get back to Mainside. Me and my friends turned and booked it for our 7-ton. I flipped on the battery switch and my buddy cranked the truck on. As we began to start moving, I looked out the window in time to see these things reach the camp. A Marine who hadn't realized what was going on until it was too late was impaled by one of the creature's claws and fell to the ground. I watched as he tried to crawl away, but this thing leaned over a bit on his upper torso and completely bit off his head with a single bite. As we began to get out of there, I saw a Humvee that had 3 of these things on racing towards it. The guy in the turret tried to flip the 50 cal around to unload into the creatures, but he wasn't fast enough, and one of these creatures ripped him out of where he was at and threw him to one of the others. He didn't have time to move before the thing sank its claws into his chest and began to devour him. I watched as the thing on top of the Humvee then jumped down into the hood and shattered the bullet-resistant front glass and pulled out the mangled corpse of the driver and ran off into the desert with him. The remaining 3 Marines got out and made a run for our truck. I tapped my buddy to let them get on. However, they never made it. One by one, the things picked them all off and ran off with them, their screams fading into the desert. By the time we got back into the main road back to the main site and caught up with the rest of our unit, we noticed how active the night sky had become. There were helicopters everywhere with searchlights. We figured someone had called it, and they were trying to find the creatures, or the missing Marines. Well, what was left of them anyways. When we were next up at the checkpoint, I noticed something off about the guys manning it. They were wearing all black, and each one of them had a black ski mask over their face, and their night vision goggles down. They didn't have any patches, name tapes, or IDs with them. They were armed to the teeth though. One of their vehicles had a minigun mounted on it. They all carry high-power rifles with high-tech sights, laser sights, and other attachments on their rifles. When it was our turn, they had us step out of the truck and tell them what we saw. After we explained everything, the guy in charge looked at my friend and listed off his full name, date of birth, social security, where his mom and dad were, the name of his dog that he had when he was in middle school. He then looked at me and did the same thing. Once he was done, he looked at both of us. If you ever say a word of what actually happened here tonight, you and your families will disappear for good. Do you understand? We both nodded with our jaws on the floor. The guy had mentioned things that I had never told anyone about. They sent us on back to the main side of the base. I got out about a year after that, but I never went on another field op again. To this day, I still remember that night. When I go to bed each night, I just hope that whoever they were, they kill those things, so no more Marines have to go out like that. In short, if you're ever stationed in 29 Palms, Cali, and you go on a field op, keep an eye out in the dark, and be sure you aren't too far away from a vehicle, and also pray that those things don't decide to turn you into a meal. This was told by my childhood's bestie's uncle during a family gathering in the early 90s. They were a big family and always had cookouts and gatherings, often inviting friends from church or work. So there would always be a nice crowd, and sometimes it went into the evening. This night, some of the men there were police officers, so they were trading stories. While the grown-ups were talking, us as preteens were sitting nearby talking kid stuff. But then I noticed that the grown-ups' tones kinda changed, and I turned around to listen. So for context, we're a small town right at the edge of the two different tribal reservations. The sheriff's office patrolled a 30-minute stretch of res that bordered the two different tribal lands. It is a flat forest that is beautiful during the day, but scary as hell at night. There is one gas station, grocery store, in a little community right in the middle of this 30-minute drive. It closed around 9 p.m. each night. Around 11 p.m., one of the sheriff's deputies got a call over the radio to check something out, just south of that community. Now that area was the most isolated, and there was only a very few people that lived there. There are no streetlights other than some out in the stretch of lands where people lived, so this part was a very dark area. The officer went out to the area, and I don't remember if he found a problem. My vague memory is thinking it had something to do with a fence being down, which is bad because some people actually have herds of sheep, cows, horses, so that could cause an accident. He took care of business and started back towards our town. He had only driven about a mile back when he saw a man walking on the side of the road. Again, on this stretch of road, it is so dark, even people can be hit by a car. So the officer stopped to at least get that guy home. The man was young, quiet. He had long black hair. His clothes were old and dirty. Often there are hitchhikers that go from that area to our town to hit the bars and then hitchhike home. But this man was going towards town, which was weird because it was way past midnight. By now, nothing was open. The officer tried to get the man's address, but the man just said, "Take me down the road. I'll tell you when to stop." And it was towards our town, and the little community was also ahead, so that was most likely where he was headed. The officer had a truck, and when someone picks up a hiker, they climb in the back and hit the window when their destination is reached. The officer said, "Alright, jump in," and started down the road. While he was driving, he would take a look back and see the back of the man's black hair. After some time had gone by, and the man wasn't knocking on the window, and they passed the community, and the houses were very few again, the officer decided to look back at the man again, and he was gone. Now if he was drunk, which he didn't seem to be when they spoke, he might have passed out and missed his turn. So he pulls over and thinks that he's gonna wake this guy up. He looks in the back and there's no one there. The officer is like, "What the fuck? Tell me he didn't jump out. He has to be drunk." The cop turns around and tries to backtrack. He passed the community again, but he doesn't see anyone laying on the road or sitting or even walking. He turned into the gas station and kind of tells the radio about it, and then he decides to just head back to town. While driving, he says that he starts to hear knocking on the truck. However, it wasn't the back window. The knocking continues, and he's still driving, but he starts to look in all his mirrors, and he swears he sees a coyote-like figure at the right side of the truck, running alongside of it, on two legs, banging the side of the truck by now. He is going about 55 to 60 miles per hour, and at this point, this thing didn't look like it had any issue, running right next to the truck, hitting it. The officer swerved and overcorrected, but gets control and stops. But he stops for a second just to check his doors, and then starts to haul ass. He stated that he was going around 80 to 90, and the road also had some curves, so the speed limit is still 55. He was so terrified, and he was so relieved when he went over to the little hill to our town and saw the city lights. I'll never forget this story, and it's kind of rare when I drive that road, but when I do, it's never at night. This happened to me about 8 years ago, but surely something I'll always remember. My grandfather had made it clear that I should never talk about what I experienced, and that I should just forget that it even happened. But I feel like I won't ever let go of this memory if I wouldn't be able to release it. So anyways, I was 11 at that time. It was summer, and it's the time that we visit our vacation house, which I'll say is pretty secluded. We don't have any close neighbors, and the house is literally in the middle of the woods. I never disliked going there, as it's close to a river with a waterfall. My parents allowed me to stay in the house with my grandpa, as my mom and dad had a business trip, but I remember them promising that they'll follow as soon as they get back from their trip. My grandpa picked me up around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. The drive was around 3 hours. The evening had arrived, and we're just halfway through because of a major car crash. We were stuck in the traffic for a long time. We almost finished 10 radio dramas while waiting through the traffic. We were finally driving up the mountains, which means we're close home, but the road is very dark and covered in trees. There are some parts of the road where it looked like we're driving through tunnels, as the tree branches were covering the sky. Then, a loud noise broke the silence between the two of us. My grandpa hit a big rock that was sitting in the middle of the road, almost like someone had intentionally put it there to cause inconvenience. This caused the car to smoke, and it turns out that our clutch overheated. My grandpa then decided that we would spend the night in the car, as he was very tired, and he's not very good at driving in the dark. I was also very tired, so I was ready to fall asleep. My grandpa said that he'll get his pillow and flashlight at the compartment of the car. I was listening to him move and arrange our stuff, and then I fell asleep. I wasn't sure how long I had been sleeping, but I got woken up from a sound of scratching under the vehicle. almost like someone had a rock and was writing something under their car. I was 100% sure that I was gonna forget it and just sleep in. But as I moved my eyes, I saw one small dash of light in this dark-ass road. It was my grandpa, facing a tree. He was pointing his flashlight in the total black of nothing. I thought he also heard that scratching sound and he was looking for it. I was about to get out of the car to call him, telling him to get back in because I'm scared shitless. But suddenly, I noticed that his neck was very long, and it had a patch of hair running through his whole neck. I knew something fucked up was going on, so I started looking around the car. I panicked, and there I saw my grandpa, covered in blankets, sleeping at the back of the car. I quickly woke him up and told him what I saw. He dismissed it, saying that maybe I was just dreaming, or that I was tired, but I knew he was also scared from what I just told him, and he tried to stay calm so I wouldn't panic. Just a few minutes later, the scratches were back and it got louder, and there were also weird noises under the car, almost like someone was smashing their hands under the vehicle. I was panicking. My eyes were filled with tears to the point where all my eyesight was all blurry, and my head hurting from all the anxiety. However, this time, my grandpa heard everything. He was awake. He said there might be squirrels or rabbits under the car, and he'll go check it out, which I quickly opposed as I seen the stuff on scary movies, and it never goes well. And I was also scared to be left in the car. As soon as he opened the door, the flashlight, where whatever that thing I saw in the woods lit, it was laying on the floor. The light was facing our car. Then, I heard the scariest sound I ever heard in my life. It was my mom's voice singing, but we both knew that whatever that thing isn't my mom. The voice sounded disgusting and distorted. The voice was strange, and it sounds like it was pretending and trying to imitate the human language. The voice lasted for 1 minute, and the last part sounded so terrifying as it sounded like it was shrieking from pain, but almost like laughing at the same time. My grandpa closed the door, locked all of them, and sat in the driver's seat. He was shaking. We shared eye contact. He was so pale, and he looked so fucking terrified. We were both sitting in pure fear and silence, as the radio signal isn't that clear around that area. And then, at that same moment, my grandpa decided to drive back home, and he told me to forget everything that happened and to start praying every night. So this story happened about 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, but it's the single most scariest thing I have ever experienced. It's also good to note that it happened in mid-December. I'm from Iowa, and the winters here get cold at night. Like if you get stuck outside, you will end up dying. It's that type of cold. That plus the snowfall makes everything dead silent. You can hear anything and everything inside the house, and even immediately outside of it. Well, me and my best friend were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just having a boring winter night playing video games. We were also the only ones home. The reason it was just us is because my mother went from work straight to a bar to grab a few drinks with coworkers. So me and my friend thought it would be a good idea to break into the family wine. As we were sitting there opening the first bottle, I hear the door to the garage door open and slam shut. I immediately go, oh shit, and start looking for places to hide the bottle. My friend then says, I thought you said your mom was supposed to be out all night. Yeah, she was supposed to, I replied. I then hear a few heavy stomps, and I hear my mom. Meows and boo. Anyone home? I yell back up the stairs. Hey mom, just hanging out in the basement. I hear a few more steps move from the garage door towards the stairs, and she yells out again. Hey, can you come help me with something? I need you up here. I replied back quickly, trying to find a good place to hide the wine bottle. Yeah, I'll be up there in just a second. Then, there was silence for about 20 seconds. Hey, is there anyone down there with you? She yelled back in a more concerned, serious tone, in a voice that was slightly off of my mother's. This was the first thing that told me something wasn't right. Our family never cared if anyone was over, as our house was a very open house to all family and friends. And the voice, it was just wrong. Like it sounded like my mother's voice, but it was missing something. And I couldn't put my finger on it. I was creeped out, so I replied, just, Colton and I are here. After I yelled that back to her, I found a good place to hide the bottle and began walking up the steps to the next level. As I was walking up the steps, I couldn't help but feel the overbearing silence of the house, and this feeling that something wasn't right. When I got to the top of the steps, I looked over to where the door to the garage is, and also the kitchen right next to it, and it's black. All of the lights were off, and there wasn't even any moonlight shining through any windows. I walked over to the kitchen yelling out, "Mom, where are you? Where you at?" There was no reply, just silence and darkness. I get this weird shock in my system, like a feeling of full needles, and my adrenaline kicks in full force. I have to get out of here as fast as possible. My mother was not home. I run back downstairs, grabbing my jacket along the way. "Hey, what's wrong?" Colton says. "My mom's not home, dude." I reply as fast as I can, looking for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking with her." I could see the confusion in his face. "There's no one home. We need to leave right now." I took a few steps towards the back door that opens up to the yard, and then I see my dog shaking on the couch, and my cat growling behind it. I couldn't leave them. I just knew that if we left, something would happen. "Are we leaving?" Colton said, still confused as all hell. "No, I can't leave them here alone. Something is really off. I'm gonna call my mom and figure this out." I pull out my phone and call my mom. She picks up immediately. "Meowsin' Boo, what's going on?" She answers, "Mom, were you just home? I thought I heard you yelling for me from the second level, and when I went up there, you weren't there," I said in desperation, hoping that she was playing a joke. "No, I'm just now leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay? What do you mean you heard me?" I fill her in on the whole story and she rushes home. Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she got home. However, before she did, you could hear something upstairs. Not walking or sitting on things, but a pressure in the air. I know this is weird, but it felt like what I would describe as a black hole was slowly moving from one room to the next. And the word that I would use to describe this, hungry. When she got home, you could feel this thing just leave, just as quick as it came. Like an overbearing predatory presence had just flown away. We still have never figured out what the hell was going on, and this is just one story of many unexplainable things that have happened to us. But this is the easiest to write down. My mother has passed away now, and I have moved away to Arizona. But whenever I go back to Iowa, and I see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what happened. I will never know what happened, but I do know that whatever it was, it had my mother's voice, and it was evil, and it was hungry. This is going to be short because this just started happening in the last 5 days. There really isn't much background story except that my brother has been acting weird since he got back from a sleepover at a friend's house 6 days ago. By weird, I mean distant, quiet, and most important, his presence in our house has felt off and a little strange, like it doesn't feel like him anymore. You know when your parents had a friend over, except to you, he or she is a complete stranger, and whenever you're in a room with them or near them, you feel uncomfortable because they're actually someone that you don't really know, so you can't speak to them or find it difficult to make conversation. That's what he feels like. 5 days ago, I woke up at 3:45 a.m. and looked at my door. It was slightly open, and I could see my brother standing there, grinning. This of course scared the shit out of me and made me jump. I walked out and turned the hallway lights on, and that's when I noticed that his eyes were shut, but he was still grinning and breathing very lightly. I quickly jumped to the conclusion that he's just sleepwalking, so I led him back to his bed and left. I didn't talk to him about it the next day because I thought it was a one-time thing. I didn't wake up on the 4th day, but it's safe to say that he was standing there staring at me. 3 days ago, I woke up and saw him standing there again. This time the door was fully open, and he was grinning from ear to ear. Now call me paranoid, but I'm 98% sure there was someone or something, a presence maybe, behind him. 4 a.m. and he went back to sleep. I wasn't home on the 2nd day, so nothing happened to me except for a weird dream where I was in a bedroom and he was in the corner, grinning with his eyes wide open. However, last night, that was the scariest. I woke up at 3:20 and I noticed him standing there again. This time, he was smiling. His teeth were visible, except it was an inhuman smile. It looked like his teeth were those of a shark, and it spread across his face in an unnatural manner. Everything was silent. My window was flapping from the wind, but I couldn't hear anything. It felt like I was in a void. Then he started to creep up slowly towards me, and I tried to move, but I couldn't. I literally could not move my body or my head. It was like a force on my chest holding me down, and my hands and legs being held down. I couldn't close my eyes or even say anything. I just slept there in fear, like I had never felt so scared in my life. In my head, I knew it was my brother, but it didn't feel like him. I felt like I was gonna die. He got up to my face, and I mean dead center, and he just stopped there and looked at me. His eyes were not open, but fuck me, it felt like they were. His breathing got heavier and heavier. I started crying. I mean actual tears from being scared dripping down my face. 30 minutes. We were like that for 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. Close to 3:55 a.m., he stopped, and the expression changed to that of an evil look again. He clenched his fist and punched me on my face in a hammering-like motion and caused my nose to bleed. Like he was punching me on my face and I couldn't move or scream or do anything, so I just laid there and took it. I won't forget what he said. He came up to my ear and whispered, "You're gonna die in this house," then went back to his room. The second his door closed, I felt this surge of energy and I jumped out of bed and fell on the ground. I was panicking and breathing heavy. I didn't know what to do. I went into the bathroom and cleaned myself up by washing blood off my hands and nose and went downstairs. I sat there all morning until everyone was up. I fell asleep on the sofa and I didn't see him leave, but I saw him come back, but he went straight to bed. It's 2 a.m. right now, and I'm sitting in the living room with the lights on, the TV on, and I'm on the laptop just waiting. I'm not sure what's gonna happen, but I'll let you guys know. Last night, some shit got weird. I mean, really weird. At 3:15 a.m., I sat downstairs, lights on, wide awake, ready to see what would happen. 3:30 a.m., I'm in the kitchen. Sounds normal, right? But I don't remember walking there or how I got to the kitchen. I'm just there, staring at my fridge. I turned around and noticed that my fridge was my only source of light. 3 knocks, continuously, coming from the kitchen window. Someone was knocking outside. These knocks came in 3s, 6 times. Then I turned to face my door, and there he was, just standing there. The best I can describe it this time is that his entire body was blacked out, including his face. He stood there and the only thing visible was his open wide eyes, and they were more white than normal. I could make out that he was grinning, ear to ear. I tried calling his name, but every time I did, he just shook his head in a violent manner and making this squealing sound. I tried calling his name again, and his head shook and turned even more violent to the point that it made me feel sick. He kept shaking his head, so I tried to move close to the lights to turn it on, and that's when he stopped and smiled in a way that made me jump out of my skin. I jumped back and said his name again, but this time he shook his head and said no. This time louder, loud enough that my parents easily should have woken up from it. I looked at the window, and when I looked back, my brother wasn't there anymore. I turned the lights on, and of course, they didn't fucking work. I tried stepping out of the kitchen, and this is the weird part. Every time I walked out, I walked back in, if that even makes sense. It was like I would walk out of the kitchen, but somehow end up back at the entrance walking in, and every time I tried to walk out, I just felt sick. Like I shouldn't leave the kitchen by all means, but at the same time, I didn't feel safe in there. That place felt like it had no other presence, but only that of an evil thing. I tried running out, and sure enough, I found myself in a loop where I just ran back into the kitchen. This time, my brother was there, and he had a knife in his hands. He was dark black. I mean, his whole body was blacked out, except his eyes. They were the only thing that had some sort of color to him. I even thought of the possibility that my brother was still upstairs asleep, and that this was someone else, or better yet, something else. We stood there for what felt like hours. Then he ran at me with the knife and started swinging. I grabbed him trying to stop him, and his body felt hot. I mean, incredibly hot. Bad enough that I couldn't hold him for long. I thought of screaming, but I couldn't. I really couldn't. I felt like something was choking me, making it harder for me to breathe or talk. So I kicked the fridge till something fell and broke on the ground. Now, we were on the floor. He was on top of me and had the knife inches away from my throat. His body temperature switched, then turned cold. Then he started saying what I'm gonna assume is Latin words. And then all of a sudden he just stopped. He stopped trying to force the knife into me and just stared at me. His face was inches away from mine, and he smiled at me, and his eyes became wider than normal. I felt nothing during that moment. It was like he got me or something. We just lay there like that. His white eyes and sharp dagger teeth inches away from my face, and me just laying there looking at him emotionless. That's when my parents started shuffling about upstairs, and then he did something that's gonna stay with me forever. He opened his mouth, and everything was blacked out, and he screamed in this inhuman manner. If I'm being honest, I heard at least several different voices in that scream. I pushed him off of me, and he moved across the kitchen near the kitchen window, and he stood up. My parents came downstairs and turned the lights on. I put the knife down and looked at my brother, who was back to normal, but he looked like he had just woken up. He asked why he was down there. My parents looked at us confused, and I said, I saw him sleepwalking, so I followed him downstairs. My mom looked at the kitchen counter and saw the knife. Then she looked at me and saw hand marks and bruises all over my hands from the fight I had with him. She asked why the knife was there, and I said someone was knocking at the window and we got scared. She looked at me, then to my brother, and then at my dad, who all looked just very confused. They told us that they heard us making loud noises and knocking around, so they woke up. I said we weren't doing anything. My dad then got annoyed and told us to get back to bed. I led my brother back upstairs. I caught a glimpse of my mom when we walked back, and she smiled at my brother, but looked at me, and her expression changed to a concerned look. The one and only time I went hunting was with my father when I was 11. My mom didn't work, so it was up to him to provide for us. My entire life he worked more than he was at home. When he did come home, he would drink in front of the TV, too exhausted to do anything. The years crept up on him, and he finally noticed how old I had gotten, and how I was already shaping up to be a disappointment in his eyes. I was small for my age. I stayed inside to read instead of playing sports. My body was so frail I got sick often. When he finally truly looked at me for the first time, he didn't recognize the son that lived in his house. Therefore, he thought that hunting would be the answer. If I would man up and shoot something, maybe I might grow into the person he wanted. We never really spent any time together. Hunting with my father felt like being stuck inside the forest with a stranger. What kind of person even enjoys camping? Was I even missing something? My father kept sipping away at a steel water bottle that I knew didn't have water inside. Without it, he never would have lasted the day. We caught no fish at the lake for lunch the first day. Trying out luck, we went into the forest trying to shoot something for dinner. We packed something to eat, but not much. My father worked hard. However, he was supporting all three of us on his own. I knew it would be four of us soon. My mom hadn't told him yet, and I wasn't sure how he would take it. I really prayed she would leave him. As heartless as that was to hope for, we could go to my uncle's house, so my father could be alone. Maybe retire in a few years without having to worry about supporting a family. Even as a child, I could see how much his job broke his body a little more every day. In my mind, my mother didn't have any kind of feelings for this stranger. Instead of going outside playing with neighborhood friends, I worried about my family's future. In the woods, hunkered down, my father waited for something to come into his sight. For the first time, he made the attempt to talk with me and teach me things. After a while, when he thought I could be trusted, he placed the rifle into my hands and let me get into position. It was far too big for my short arms and little hands. I was scared that if I shot it, the recoil would break my shoulder. I didn't know the first thing about guns. In the movies I had seen, they always had a powerful recoil. Line it up, our dinner's over there, my father whispered in my ear. A rabbit came into a clearing. He spotted it first, looking through the sight. I went through everything I had just learned. I only needed to pull the trigger. Such a simple little thing. My father would teach me more things patiently and be proud of me. The first hunting trip with his son would become a cherished memory. But it didn't go like that. I froze up. I just couldn't shoot the rabbit. Aside from not wanting to kill another living creature, I felt like if I shot it, I would be living a lie. My father would try his best to act like the person he should be, teaching me how to skin the rabbit and how to cook it. But he would not actually care about me. He never did. This trip would never turn into a family relationship he wanted. The small rabbit jumped off and out of sight to become a meal for something else. I eased up the grip on the rifle the moment before it was snatched from my hands. My father shot at the rabbit now hidden in the bush. "Why didn't you shoot it?" he hissed at me. When he got angry, his voice got low. He was never the type to yell and scream. I wonder if he did shout at me, I might be less scared of him. Whenever I had a nightmare, it was always the same. My father sitting in the living room in the dark, staring at the TV. I stood in the doorway looking at him, just waiting. The waiting crept dread into my bones. I hated the wait. I wish he would just finally scream at me. I couldn't stand his silent rage any longer. Go back to camp. You're useless. Those words should have done nothing to me. After all, this man wasn't my father. Not really. He was a stranger. And yet, I felt my face full of shame. But I still didn't regret not shooting the rabbit. I went back to the camp trying to make myself useful. I collected firewood. I cleaned up and did anything else that I thought would make my father happy. I heard the sound of a truck. We parked pretty close by, and my stomach sank at the thought of him just leaving me here. But our gear cost a lot of money. He will leave his son in the woods, but not things he worked hard for. For hours I was alone in the tent. I brought a book along. I nearly finished it by the time my father returned. He smelled drunk and like fast food. I knew he had gone into town for supper and a few drinks alone. I only ate a hot dog and a handful of marshmallows. The arrangement was fine by me. The rest of the night he spent by the fire, just drinking. The scene identical to how he spent time at home, just looking forward yet not taking anything in. He stayed outside even after night fell. I went back into our tent trying to sleep, finding it impossible. I thought about how things would change when my new sibling came, if they ever made it to that point. I feared that my father would try to make sure that he didn't have another mouth to feed. I wanted nothing more to get away from that man, even though in a way, he had never done anything to me. The nothing made me feel as if something was coming. At some point I fell asleep, but some rustling outside woke me up. In my drowsy state I sat up hearing my father's voice outside. Take him, please. Not me. He was crying. The man that I didn't know a thing about was crying. His voice was very faint, as if far away, more begging and pleading until I heard something that made me scramble into the corner of the tent. He finally broke the silence, and the noise I always dreaded came. He screamed, and just kept screaming as if his life depended on it. Clutching my knees to my chest, tears came to my eyes as I could do nothing but listen. Cracks from the rifle came. Whatever he was firing at, he missed, or it didn't care. The entire exchange only took a few minutes that felt like years. Finally, his voice drifted away, as if he was being dragged at a fast pace. At first, I wanted to stay inside the tent until morning. I cried hard until my throat felt raw and my eyes hurt. When my crying spell stopped, I decided to see if he dropped the rifle. I would need a weapon until I could leave when dawn came. I unzipped the tent only enough to peek outside. The dying fire did not give enough light to see by. I needed to go outside. Finding a flashlight, I carefully got out, hyper aware of every sound around me. Scanning the ground, I saw the hot dogs were still where I left them. If my father was attacked by a wild animal, why didn't they take these as well? Did the smell attract something and decided a full-grown man would be a better meal? I saw no sign of the rifle, only tracks in the dirt where my father made his last stand. I felt sick because I realized he was coming towards the camp instead of the truck when he got snatched away. He was either trying to save me or wanted to use me as bait. Thinking the truck would be a better place to wait until the morning, I started to look around trying to find a trail towards it. I stopped when I heard a voice. Please, not me. Help. It sounded so hurt and awful, but I knew that was my father calling out. For the first time in my life, he was trying to reach me. I abandoned the idea of the truck. I foolishly turned away and went towards the voice. For hours I walked in those woods getting hopelessly lost. I felt sick with fear. Anything could be in the dark, and I only had a small flashlight to protect myself. Whatever took my father easily overpowered a full-grown man. I didn't have a choice if it came across me. I would let my emotions take over and it might get me killed. Then again, I was only a child back then, so I shouldn't be too hard on myself. Please, please. The voice came from close by, very low and raspy, but still my father's voice. I had been walking for hours at that point. My small body wasn't meant to move this much in the cold, wet darkness. I knew a fever already coming, and wasn't thinking clearly as I walked towards the voice. I didn't even consider it may be someone else aside from who I wanted to find. Coming into a clearing, I started to look around with my flashlight. The small beam of light landed on something that made me choke on air. Someone killed a deer, skinned it, and hung it from a tree. In the darkness, that's what it looked like. I knew what a skinned deer looked like. It's what my mind wanted to see. The kill was so fresh, blood still dripped down onto the grass. I couldn't stop myself from starting to take a shorter and shorter breath when a whisper of a thought came to my mind that the body wasn't a deer. That's not him, I said out loud, only to myself. That's not him, it's a deer. It's a small deformed deer with small legs. Unable to stop myself, I suddenly hunched over and threw up my meal from hours before, mostly bile that stung my throat. Seeing such a sight in the dark made me completely snap. Instead of screaming, I started to laugh, on my knees alone, lost and scared beyond words. Weak chuckles at first, that turned into a cackling, that soon turned into heavy sobs that locked up my chest. It's not him. I was sobbing, holding myself, not being able to look at the body in front of me. After getting another few glances between tears, I saw how different the legs were compared to what deer legs should look like. I only held on to some hope it wasn't my father skinned and hanging from a tree, because I had just heard him a few minutes before entering the clearing. The kill was new, but skinning took a while, even if you knew what you were doing. In the next few moments, I saw why my hope was unfounded. I forced myself to stop crying when I saw a pale face in the dark on the other end of the clearing. The face looked at me through the trees, just beyond the skinned body. I opened my mouth to ask for help, but nothing came out aside from a croak. To my horror, the face came out of the trees with the rest of its terrible body. I didn't understand what I was seeing, even though the pale creature stood out in the darkness. I wanted to believe I was still in my tent dreaming this entire thing. The monster was a thing of nightmares. It was skinny, so much so I could see every bone in its body. It had arms so long they walked on its elbows, the rest of its arms folding backwards, sticking up above its head. The same was for its legs. It crawled on its knees, legs pointed up towards the sky. The pale thing saw me. Inhuman sunken eyes on a flat human-shaped face. Standing up, I thought I could run. It was still a few feet away, and judging from how deformed its body was, I doubt it could move very fast. I only got to take a single step back when it raised an arm. The rest of its arm snapped ahead, easily covering the distance of the clearing. I assumed it couldn't reach more with its entire arm because it was bent back, but I was mistaken. Twisted fingers grabbed the front of my shirt. I was dragged, too in shock to do anything. Raising me up, I met those horrible black eyes, the smell of rotting breath, nearly made me pass out. I was so small and frail I could do nothing to fight against this monster. Most likely my father was dead. It would skin me and eat me, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. The whole situation was so bleak, I surprised myself over what I did next. I started to laugh again. The monster's features twisted in confusion. I still laughed until tears came back to my eyes, and that thing, whatever it was, copied me. It laughed my own voice back towards me, and we both ended up laughing until I physically couldn't any longer. I wish I had an explanation of how I escaped from that creature. I was told later that I had been found on a hiking trail. A week later, nearly starved to death. Even after my body recovered, my mind didn't. Everyone assumed I had killed my father in those woods, and the event just broke me. I wish I could believe that, and that the creature I had seen wasn't real. I don't remember the 2 years after I had been found. I ate and slept, not doing much else. One day, I weakly laughed at a joke I overheard. When the doctors found out I would react to any kind of comedy, they were able to get me to laugh myself back to a new normal. I remember seeing that monster in the woods. Then, I was with my mother and a new little sister. No memories in between. I haven't yet told her about that creature. They found some rope with my father's blood on it. However, they didn't know where his body was, or even how I got up into the tree to tie up that rope to start with. The case was still open, and would be for the rest of my life. I do still want to give a warning to everybody about that thing in the woods. I'm sure it's still out there waiting. I don't know why it let me go. Maybe it was thankful I had given it the perfect voice to draw in others towards it. So if you ever go into the woods and you hear a child laughing, don't go towards it. That's actually the time to leave before it's too late. It was late June of 1968. My dad was 12. My grandparents had moved a few months earlier from Tucson, Arizona to Concho, Arizona. Concho was very different, both in landscape and temperature. Sitting at 5,000 feet above sea level, the summer temperatures were around 70 degrees versus the hundreds in summertime Tucson. Resting at the edge of the White Mountains, the land is red, yellow, and brown sandstone cliffs and buttes against a larger ancient basalt flow ridge that lines the north from the Springville volcanic range. Well, Old Concho, as it's referred to now, sits among the high desert with large basalt ridge bordering the east and north. In the valley, a dry riverbed was dotted by large cottonwood trees. The buttes and ridges boasted large twisted cedar trees. Only about 200 people lived in Concho at the time. It's in pretty close proximity to the petrified forest. Therefore, petrified wood was found on the valley floor. There were also numerous ancient Anasazi ruins scattered along the valley. My great uncle had moved his family to Concho as well. My grandpa had recently finished his engineering degree, and he and my great uncle were doing highway construction all around the White Mountains. They had both purchased land in the Concho area for pretty cheap. My great uncle had 2 sons who were a year older and a year younger than my dad, Tony and Zach. Tony was 13 and Zach was 11. They would spend their days exploring the surrounding landscapes, joined by my dad's American Bulldog, Sarge. They had found quite a few ruins, numerous pictographs, and some old abandoned homesteads, most likely from the 19th century. Every morning, they would load up their bags with canteens, bologna sandwiches, and head out into the wilderness to play and explore. My grandparents and great aunt and uncles had only one rule that was for the children, and that was to return by sunset. As my dad recalls, on one summer morning, they ended up hiking towards the edge of the giant basalt ridge to explore. After going for about a mile or so, they came upon an arroyo running adjacent to the ridge. Large black boulders and giant slabs of sandstone peppered the wash. The banks were pretty steep, but they would have to cross it if they want to explore the ridge on the other side. They made their way down slowly. Once in the arroyo, they realized that the opposite bank was too steep to climb, so they started following it west to find a better place to climb up. My dad said as soon as they got into the riverbed, he started getting an unnerving feeling, like they were being watched. He said it was extremely quiet, no birds or cicadas chirping. It was hot as well, no breeze stirred the air. The further they walked down the wash, the more a sense of urgency began to build in his gut. He didn't say anything though, for fear that his cousins would laugh at him. About a half mile or so down the wash, it made a bend around a large volcanic boulder. Suddenly, Sarge began a low growl, hair standing up on his back. This actually startled all three of the kids. Looking around, they didn't see anything, so encouraging the dog, they moved closer to the bend. Sarge stayed rooted to the spot, growling and barking. All three of the boys began to get scared. They agreed that maybe they should just turn around. They noticed that there was a spot where they could climb out of the wash. They hadn't noticed it at first, but it looked almost like a game trail. With adrenaline fueling them, they hauled ass up the side of the embankment towards the ridge, the dog darting after them. The whole time the bad feeling was growing stronger with my dad. They stopped at the top to catch their breath. Sitting against a large boulder, they took some drinks from the canteen and assured each other that Sarge probably smelled a coyote or spotted a rabbit. Here, the game trail was more apparent. It had even worn into some of the volcanic and sandstone that protruded from the ground. They noticed that there were a lot of petroglyphs dotting the black rocks, geometric shapes, animal, human figures. There were so many. Finally, they found a large juniper with a trunk and ate their lunch in shade. Bellies full and excitement replacing fear, they hurried along the trail as it slowly zigged and sagged the side of the basalt ridge, avoiding large areas of rock falls. The pictographs began to change as well along the trails. Lots of spirals and horn-looking man. My dad even said there was one that looked like a UFO. Turning around a bend, the trail disappeared. Only open space of the edge of a cliff. There was nowhere else to go. The cliff dropped off to one side, and a sheer cliff going up about 50 feet on the other side. My dad, he was disappointed, but also a little relieved, as the sun was getting further west, and they were pretty far from Concho now. They could see the town in the distance, as well as the holy mountain and mesas that dotted the distant Navajo res. Even though they were disappointed, they decided that it was worth looking at the view. They started making their way down the trail when they spotted an opening in the cliffside, a side canyon. They hadn't noticed it on the way up. It was behind a large twisted cedar. The tree's shadow had hidden it. It looked almost like there was another trail going into the divide. The opening was about 4 feet wide. Looking at it, that unnerving feeling returned to my dad. His stomach dropped and he felt like it was twisting in knots. The hair on the back neck stood up. Tony suggested that they should detour and check it out. My dad protested, saying that they needed to get back. Zach stayed silent. He looked as scared as my dad felt. Tony laughed when looking at them and called them both sissies. He said if they didn't want to go, it was fine, that they could wait there for him and be babies if they wanted. That's when Sarge ran down the trail and was out of sight. My dad whistled for him, but he didn't return. Zach decided he would follow Tony, so my dad stayed behind while they entered the narrow black walled canyon. When they moved out of my dad's field of vision, the wind picked up, blowing through the canyon and trees, making a creepy sound. It was quiet except the wind, and my dad thought he heard faint voices on the air. He shivered, the ominous feeling growing stronger. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and still, Tony and Zach had not returned. A large cloud had covered the sun, and drops of rain began to fall. My dad moved under the cedar to get out of the light rain that began to fall. He sat on a rock and began to shiver. Suddenly, something grabbed his shoulder. He jumped about 3 feet and screamed. Then he heard laughing. It was Tony and Zach. They looked extremely excited. "Luke, you'll never believe what we found," they said. "We found some Indian steps and they lead to a cave." They begged my dad to come see. It wasn't far, only about 10 minutes into the canyon. My dad ended up following them, knowing they weren't going to agree to go home until they showed them. Plus, he felt a little braver and more intrigued now. Sure enough, around a bend, and about 20 yards into the canyon was more wide, about 20 to 30 feet across, and there were indeed foot and handholds carved into the rock wall. My dad had seen steps like them before, when his parents had taken him to Chaco Canyon National Park. They were smaller than the ones in Chaco and only went up about 20 feet to the darkened mouth of a small cave. He shivered, from excitement or fear, he wasn't sure. From the bottom of the canyon, there was no way of telling how large the cave was. They dropped their packs and decided to use the foot and handholds to climb up to the cave, against my dad's better judgment. The rain had stopped, but they slowly and carefully made their way because the rock had become slick. It took about 10 minutes to ascend. My dad called for Sarge from the top again, and the dog still hadn't returned. The cave was much larger and deeper than they expected, and the entrance was decorated with hundreds of petroglyphs. The light didn't penetrate very far in, but they could see light in the distance from an opening in the roof. So they entered. Light adjusting to the dark, they started to notice that the ground was covered with objects. What looked like rocks and debris now revealed itself to be pots, beautiful, painted pots of all shapes and sizes, black on white, painted with geometric patterns, and animals, red pots and even some yellow ones, large pots holding dried corn and crusty squash and beans. There were also pots filled with arrowheads and beads. They even found some instruments like drums and flutes. They didn't touch anything and kept walking deeper into the cave. They looked around in shock and in awe. They had just discovered something big, something very big. They moved now towards the second bit of light streaming in from a crack in the roof. The cave was littered with all sorts of artifacts, stone axes, pots of all shapes, colors, and sizes. As they passed under the crack, they noticed now that there were objects in alcoves in the wall. My dad moved closer to one, and his blood froze. He was looking at a human body. It was decayed skin and hair clinging to patches and its mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. He took a leap back. Tony and Zach also froze. The walls were lined with alcoves filled with dressed bodies, lining the walls as far as they could see into the darkness. Suddenly, an ominous and horrendous screech broke the silence of the cave. All three boys jumped, and my dad, looking in the direction from where the sound came, saw two red and glowing eyes. He froze, locked in place by those glowing red eyes. Suddenly, the cave was washed over with the stench of decay and death. The eyes began to move towards the boys. Slowly, another hideous growl, screech, jolted them from being petrified in place. The eyes were moving fast now, right towards them, and they heard what sounded like running footsteps. They turned and tore out of the cave as fast as they could. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them in a blind panic. The entrance to the cave was maybe 30 yards away. My dad looked back against his better judgment and saw a man on all fours, or a giant coyote. He can't be sure. He pushed himself faster, screaming for the others to also run faster. They reached the edge of the cave, having to turn around to scrabble back down the foot and handholds. Zach got there first and began descending as fast as he could. Tony was next. His face turned into a wash of horror as he went down. My dad's heart was hammering into his brain by now. He turned and saw the eyes only about 20 feet from him. The stench of decay was overpowering. It made his stomach turn. As fast as he could, he placed his feet in the first set of footholds and started clambering down the rock face. He could hear the creature's breath now, and even feel it. He refused to look up as he was going down, trying to concentrate on the hand and footholds. He heard Tony scream from below him, and looked to see Tony lose his hold and slip about 5 feet from the bottom. He landed on his side and began to scream with pain. My dad slowed himself a bit, still not daring to look back up. After what seemed like an eternity, he leaped from the cliffside down the last 2 feet. Zach was helping Tony to his feet, and Tony was frozen looking at the cave and ancient staircase. All the color gone from his face. My dad was in full panic, and not looking, grabbed Tony and helped Zach drag him away. They flew down the little canyon. Finally, before they passed the turn, my dad looked back to see the red eyes watching them from the darkness. Another screech rang from the cave, and at that moment, Sarge in a full run came from around the bend, growling and barking. He ran to the foot and handhold staircase and bellowed up that cave, the hair on his back standing straight up, snarling and growling. The sounds of the dog filled the canyon. As my dad turned the corner, he saw those red eyes retreat back into the cave. They emerged from the small canyon and stopped briefly to catch their breath, the sounds of Sarge barking and growling echoing down the canyon. Tony at this point was now crying, his face washed with pain. His arm, he said. He thinks he broke it. Zach was silent. My dad was then asking Tony if he could make it home. Tony responded he sure the hell wasn't staying anywhere near whatever that was. Suddenly, a shrill cry came from the canyon. It was a dog, in pain. "Sarge," my dad cried, but Tony and Zach had started running down the trail. My dad screamed again, tears coming from his eyes. There was no response. It was quiet. My dad thinks he hears something. He looks up to the canyon entrance. It sounds like drums. My dad sits there confused. Drums? What the hell? Is he losing his mind? The drums are getting loud. Is this in his mind? Where is Sarge? He can't leave him. My dad sees Zach tearing back up the trail. "Luke, we have to go." The drums are louder now, and he can hear faint chanting. Zach grabs my dad and jerks him to his feet. "Don't you hear that?" He screams and shakes my dad. "We have to run, now." My dad is woken from his grief, as fear washes over him again. He runs down the trail with Zach. Tony is waiting at the edge of the arroyo, waiting for them. The wash is now running, about 6 inches deep. They notice for the first time that a large thunderhead has developed to the south. A huge, large black storm dominating the southern horizon, lightning flashing in the distance. A new source of danger crosses my dad's mind. He tells Tony and Zach they need to cross the arroyo as fast as possible. If it floods, they will be stuck on the side with the basalt ridge, with whatever that thing was. They make their way down carefully and slowly. Tony is having a hard time because of his injured arm. They now start hearing thunder rolling across the air, and the wind has increased. My dad is keeping a close eye on the creek, which has only risen a couple of more inches. They make all the way down and across the creek. The place where they crossed is only 30 yards or so ahead, so they scrabble their way towards it. The water starts rising now, at an alarming rate. They start going as fast as their legs will carry them. They're exhausted, but keep pushing on. Suddenly, my dad, who is in the rear, starts to hear loud splashing coming from behind him. His heart drops. It followed them. It's getting closer. He closes his eyes, bracing for impact. That's when he feels something lick the back of his swinging hand. He turns, bracing for impact, and sees Sarge. Joy fills my dad. He bends down and gives Sarge a quick hug as the dog runs past, and the dog bounds after Tony and Zach as they climb out of the arroyo. My dad runs and begins to climb. When he's almost to the top, he hears crashing and loud snapping coming from the arroyo. Making it to the top, he sees a wave of brown debris filled water crash through the wash. He falls to his butt and watches as the flash flood fills the little canyon. Tony and Zach are lying on the ground, gasping for air. My dad tries to catch his breath. He feels dizzy. He feels tears welling up, and Sarge comes and licks his face. My dad sees that Sarge is covered with blood. He looks over the dog and finds several slash wounds on his back. His ear is also torn. They don't look too deep, but he can't be sure. Zach is the first to speak. He is asking what it was, but no one responds. Tony's arm is beginning to swell pretty badly, and it's only a few hours till dusk. They're all thirsty and realize in their panic they left their packs in the small canyon, along with their canteens. They are no longer in a hurry. They are exhausted. They drink some rainwater that has pooled in one of the large sandstone boulders. They figure whatever that thing was, it's not going to be getting across the arroyo for a few hours. So they slowly make their way back to Concho as the thunderhead to the south continues to fill the landscape. The three boys and Sarge make it home around 8. The sun has set, and my grandparents and great uncle and aunt are worry sick. They are relieved and angry until they see the condition of the trio and the dog. The boys tell them about their horrendous tale, and Tony's parents rush Tony to the nearest doctor. That night, my dad sleeps with Sarge at the end of his bed. Despite him being extremely exhausted, he is plagued with nightmares. One that he speaks about all the time is especially terrifying, where he sees the red eyes looking in through his window. When he wakes up though, in the morning, his curtains are closed. The rain continued for 2 or 3 days. The boys don't leave their homes, still terrified of what happened. My grandpa and great uncle are convinced what the boys encountered was a mountain lion, but they are intrigued by the story of the cave they found. A few days later, when the weather is clear, they tell the boys they want to see the cave. They make the journey faster this time, using my great uncle's Jeep. My grandpa and great uncle also bring along a couple of shotguns and rifles in case this lion is still in the cave. The boys show them the arroyo, which has been filled with new boulders and broken trees from the flooding. They find the trail and start making their way up. My grandpa in the front and great uncle taking the rear. They find the boys' packs, caught in a cedar bush. They have been shredded. My grandpa figures they must have been caught by another flood, and they ended up in the trees. They finally make it to the little hidden canyon, which has been blocked by a juniper that washed down during the rain. My grandpa and great uncle get the log out of the way, and they go to the canyon to the Indian staircase. When they look up though, they can make out the darkness of the cave. The water washed away all signs of the boys' previous passage. My grandpa figures maybe at this time of day, the cave is more illuminated, so he and my great uncle climb up the foot and handholds to the top. The boys wait at the bottom, having no desire to go back up there again. It's only my dad and Zach. Tony with his broken arm stayed home. My grandpa calls down for them to climb up. They do as they are told and climb up. When my dad reaches the top, he is stunned. The cave is gone. It's only a 20-foot rock alcove next to a black basalt cliff covered with petroglyphs. He's confused, looks around. He goes over to the wall looking for cracks and sees nothing. My grandpa and great uncle end up questioning the boys. Were they making up stories? No, they weren't. Something attacked Sarge, and the boys hadn't made up being that scared. The dads aren't mad. It's a neat area. Maybe some other weekend they will look for the cave again. My dad and Zach know that this is where the cave was. There's no doubt in their minds. They found their packs and even passed by the UFO petroglyph, but they can't convince the adults, so they make their way to the Jeep that is parked on the far bank of the arroyo. As they load up, sun sinking low in the western sky, my dad looks back at the black basalt ridge, wondering if maybe it was all just a dream, but something in the shadow of a cliff catches his eye. He squints against the sun and sees two red shining eyes looking back at him. His blood goes cold. He turns around as the Jeep pulls away. My grandparents only stayed in Concho for another few months. As soon as my grandpa finished the highway project, he got a job offer in the U.S. Virgin Islands. My dad said after that encounter, he had nightmares every night and would swear that at night he would see the red eyes outside of the house until they finally moved from Concho. After he moved, he never had a nightmare about the eyes again. But it wasn't his last encounter with the red-eyed creature. He would see it again when he became an adult. But that is a story for another time. When we first moved into my grandpa's old cabin, I had a few obvious reasons to be afraid. First of all, I was 12 years old. Second, we moved in because our old house had burned down while we were away on vacation. And finally, my grandpa was a sick, old man. Not in the sense that he had some sort of illness. Well, I suppose he did. But that illness is what ended up killing him, giving us that forsaken cabin. But in the sense that he was batshit insane. When I was younger, my grandfather would tell me horrible stories about the cabin he lived in and the woods around it. He would tell me stories of the natives who lived in the forest, something about them being cursed by God for worshipping false gods, being turned into the trees themselves, if you look closely, while not looking at all. My sadistic grandpa would say that you can still see the trees move, and if you listen carefully, you could even hear them singing their worship for their false gods. I, of course, assumed he was just crazy and was trying to scare me from wandering off in the woods, and possibly also to motivate me to go to church. But still, since I was 8 freaking years old and all. I would sometimes see a branch twitch in the wind, or hear the faint noise of a distant animal, and I would worry it was one of the natives that my grandpa would go crazy over. But of course, the stories didn't finish there. Not only was this cabin the original home to a clan of witches, but also home to a cannibal and at least 2 serial killers and a family that used to worship the devil. To make the whole illusion complete, my grandpa made up a story how he won the cabin in a game of Russian roulette against one of the previous owners. All of these stories never truly scared me. They terrified me when I thought about one of them too much, but I was actually never fearful of the stories being true. Well, except for one story that my grandfather told me. He said before the cabin was built that the natives used the area for human sacrifices, offering up human flesh and blood not only for their gods, but for creatures they believed that dwelled in the woods. These creatures, my grandfather would say, were known by many names in all kinds of folklore: Wendigos, the Jersey Devil, demons, White Walkers, Skinwalkers, the Goat Man. But my grandpa would always call them Marchar de Poule. It's French for Skinwalker. These beings of divine or mystical power were known to feed off anything from human flesh and blood to a human soul, or even fear itself. The Skinwalker would stalk their prey throughout the woods they inhabited if the sacrifice given was not enough to feed their hunger. They always attacked groups of people, never a single person. That's the reason why my grandfather said that he lived alone. The Skinwalkers would play with their food, often turning their form to look human to trick and torment anyone they sought to feed off, before finally killing them. My grandfather said once they finished feeding off of anyone unlucky enough, they would peel the skin from bone and wear it like a suit, often visiting the families of the dead to further torment mankind. The reason the story scared me so much was because I truly believed I saw one. When I was 8, I was playing in the backyard of the cabin. My grandfather sitting on the back porch, smoking his pipe and humming some old tune. He told me he was going to go inside and fetch some more tobacco, and he warned me not to go too close to the woods. I nodded and kept doing whatever I was doing at the time. After a few minutes, I felt the air around me turn cold, and everything seemed to get heavier, and I began to smell something like pennies, and the cold grew stronger. I realized it smelled exactly like blood. I felt a chill run up my spine, and I nearly gagged on the metallic taste that lingered in my mouth. I was about to stand and move back inside the cabin when I heard a soft laugh faintly beyond the tree line. I realized it sounded just like my own laugh, but now I was already scared. So scared I could hardly move at all. The smell of copper grew so strong that I thought I might pass out. But then, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I swallowed my spit and slowly turned to see a little boy standing just in front of the forest. I was almost relieved until I saw his eyes. They were pure white with no pupil, just pure white. I felt my knees buckle under me, and my lip began to quiver when it smiled at me. But when it smiled, the teeth were missing, and it was just a set of black, rotting gums that I could smell from several yards away. It lurked ahead, doubling over, seeming to hack and gag and laugh all at the same time. Then, it bent backward, placing its hands on the ground, and looked at me from between its legs. I swear I could hear bones break and crack as it began to crawl backwards into the forest, all the while making this gagging, laughing sound. That's when I passed out and wet my pants, I woke up a few minutes later from my grandfather gently shaking me up. The smell had magically disappeared, and there was no evidence of the creature I had saw just a few minutes ago. I told my grandfather what I had saw, and he grew so pale he almost looked like the little boy's eyes. He drove me back to my house, not saying a word the whole way. I told my parents what happened, and I was assured I must have just fell asleep and dreamed the whole thing. So eventually, that's what I convinced myself had happened. It still haunted my dreams, but I was convinced it was my imagination, and my grandfather's old stories were just getting to me. But then, we moved into my grandfather's cabin. Since we had lost all of our belongings in the fire, we had nothing to unpack. Even though I had convinced myself that I dreamed what I saw all those years ago, I was still worried about living there for an extended period of time. My parents let me watch some movies we rented while they were cleaning the cabin that had been vacant since my grandfather died when I was 10. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up on the couch a bit surprised I had fallen asleep for so long. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I became aware of the tapping that was coming from the front door, almost as if someone was knocking with their fingertips. Even though I had no real idea what it was, I got up to check on it. Then, I smelled it again. That heavy, thick, bloody smell that had lingered in the back of my mind for 4 years. It got so cold so fast I could see my own breath. I felt my heart thumping in my chest, and that same shiver run up my spine. I was so scared in that moment I thought I was going to break down and start crying. Then the tapping stopped. Then the smell grew worse. Beyond the front door I heard something gag and cough and laugh at the same time. My knees buckled and my lip quivered just like they did the first time. I became vaguely aware that I was slowly backing away from the door when I tripped and fell back onto the couch. Then I passed out again. Again, like the first time, I woke up from a hand gently shaking me away. I woke up and realized it was my dad looking down at me. It looked like he was out of breath, but I was so relieved he was there, and that the tapping on the door was all a dream. I then smiled at him, and he tried to do the same, but he only managed to get one side of his lips curled up. I was about to ask what was wrong when he scooped me up in his arms and told me in a hoarse voice that he was carrying me to my bed. His arms were so cold they felt like metal, but I didn't care, and I was already falling asleep again. He brought me to my room and laid me down in bed. His eyes were already closed and my mind was about to drift off. He leaned down and I felt his cold breath on my ear as my mind shut down and he pulled away, and just before I fell back into sweet sleep, I heard my dad begin to cough. A few hours passed and I woke up again. I grew scared when I remembered the tapping on the door, but soon felt better when I remembered that it must have been a dream, and was thankful my dad woke me up to carry me to my room. I sat up in bed, still just a bit scared. I looked around my room, realizing that this was the first time I actually seen it since I had fallen asleep on the couch, before I even had a chance to check out my new room. It was almost pitch black, so I could hardly see anything. I gazed over to the wall and saw a mirror. It was hard to see, but I could make out my face and my upper body. I smiled at myself and saw my reflection smile back at me. Satisfied, I went back to sleep. In the morning, my dad again gently shook me awake. He said good morning and asked what I wanted for breakfast. I told him what I wanted and then thanked him for carrying me to the bed the night before. He looked at me, confused, and told me that he didn't, but I wasn't listening anymore, because when I looked at the wall, just as I had looked at it last night, I realized there wasn't a mirror in my room, only a window. of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word nagual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latino America we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night, I remember, because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house, in a small pueblo, or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, "Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away, you have nothing to do here. Leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes, only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock, he picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a nagual. He told us he spoke to that man, and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. The story of La Planchada. The ghost is a female nurse. Some stories say she was in love with a doctor who ended up leading her to take her own life. And in others, she is simply a vengeful spirit who doesn't approve younger nurses. And in other stories, she is simply a vengeful spirit who kills patients attempting to ease their pain. Yet one story that everyone is familiar with is the one of her at Hospital Juarez in the early 1930s, where she fell in love with a doctor who was secretly engaged to another woman. She was unaware of the doctor's engagement and began having an affair with a man. A few months later, he told her he was going out of town on a business conference, but he was actually going on his honeymoon with his new wife. While he was gone, a coworker found the woman waiting for her lost love, and the coworker revealed the doctor's secret. The nurse fell into a deep depression, which led her to contracting some sort of disease. This thing eventually killed her, and she is now said to return to the room where she died. Whatever the origin is, the ghost is associated with hospitals, where it can be seen walking the halls at night and checking on patients. This spirit is often described as floating or walking, but always silent, and in some accounts, it even glows. Sometimes it's said that she appears as a normal nurse, a full human manifestation, and other times, it is said that she looks evil with the face of a horrendous creature. And a small detail that always sticks out is the uniform that she wears is usually out of date. Despite the possible horrific appearance of this ghost, it oftentimes heals patients it visits in the night, curing them of disease or healing them, and then moving them to other rooms to recover. The patients who see her describe a nurse who appeared in the room and somehow made them feel better. Hospital Juarez, being one of the possible origins of the spirit, is known for appearances of La Planchada. It is said that the ghost returns to the room where she died and heals whoever is inside. So be careful next time you or someone you know is in the hospital and you all have a pretty nurse that comes inside a room to help you. She also told me that the hospital, where she was a full nurse, was haunted by La Planchada. She said some of their sick people would report how a really nice, well-dressed nurse came in and helped them in the middle of the night. She said they would describe her as wearing an old-time uniform that hadn't been used in decades by nurses. But the thing that stood out was that they would always comment on how well kept ironed the nurse's uniform was. Now here's the scary part. Sometimes when they were at the nurse's station in the ICU, they would know when someone was going to code because they could feel as if someone had walked by the nurse's station and into the room of a sick person, but no one was there. They would then get an alert that someone was coding. The nurses used to say that it was la muerte, or death, that would come and try to get the patients. Another story she told me was that when she wasn't practicing nursing yet, she was studying nursing under the monjas, under the nuns, and she said one of the dormitories was haunted. The two dormitories were divided by a hallway, and one day, all the girls were staying in the one that wasn't haunted because they were scared. They decided to roll a coin to the other dorm, and they said that the coin rolled through the hallway and into the other dark, empty room. A few seconds after, they heard the coin stop rolling and drop. The coin was rolled back to them. My dad told me a long time ago about a time when he was a teenager in Mexico, and it was late and he was walking home after hanging out with his friends. My dad grew up in a rancho, and it was real dark, and the town that he's from is old. Anyways, there was no one out on the road, and he was walking, and he heard a sound, so he looked around at this abandoned house. The house was falling apart, and the windows were nothing but dark openings. He said he saw the back of a man sitting on the top of a roof with his back towards him. As my dad walked past the house, he looked back to see the man still on the roof, and my dad said that the man's legs were so long they touched the ground. I actually think my dad saw Slender Man long before anyone knew what that was. My family doesn't have a rancho or a ranch. However, we live near a mountain where there are 3 crucifixes, and each year in Semana Santa they replace them, which takes about 6 days. While they are gone, it is said that everybody in the community and around there says that the witches go out to hunt children. One year, they heard chains being dragged on the roof at nighttime. My father told me about a time in the 70s when he was driving to his hometown in San Luis Potosí with my mom asleep in the back and her dad in the passenger seat. He said it was late at night and it was raining. The road they were on was empty and long and had lots of turns and curves, and the visibility was bad. He said they both spotted a man standing on the side of the road in the pouring rain trying to catch a ride. My dad didn't stop and kept driving, and my abuelito, grandfather, commented saying poor guy standing out in the rain. They didn't think much of it. However, my dad said that a few minutes later, after passing another curve, they saw the same man, again, standing on the side of the road. It was the same guy. They both freaked out and my grandfather said, "Es el diablo, it's the devil," and to keep driving. When I went to Mexico with my dad in the mid-80s, they lived in a rancho, and my dad told me to go to bed once because after midnight, some of the animals that have been cursed by witches start to talk, and they will come around looking for anyone who will talk with them. So if you live in a rancho, in a farm, or own livestock or animals of any kind, be careful if you hear them talking to you tonight. My mother lived in the countryside and told us of something that happened when she was a kid. She was asleep and heard a weird clicking noise, como una pluma, like the clicking of a pen. She looked outside and said there was a weird thing outside making noise. It looked like a humanoid, grayish thing, just standing outside their house, looking in. My mom then closed the curtains and started blessing the house, and she said that she never saw the thing again. I want to say this was a skinwalker walking through the neighborhood, whistling, trying to see who would whistle or talk back. In 1987, my family and I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, a nice place, smaller than most cities, but interesting. The people there were kind, at least in the inner city. In the neighborhood where my family had moved, everyone was quiet and kept to themselves. Real quaint if you were the type of person who liked those kind of things. For me, I found it odd. No one talked to my family, or bother to communicate while we were staying there. It was like they were hiding some kind of secret. But I did notice one thing. No one came near the house. At first I thought I understood why. The house wasn't exactly in good shape, if you know what I mean. The walls outside were rusted. The grass outside was tall and filled with bushes, and the place looked like a dump. But after a while, I started to notice things. People on the streets wouldn't come near the house at all. They acted as if it was going to devour them or something. Kids on the street would point and stare, and eventually, after I started school, I learned just why the people there were so afraid of our house. You know that place is haunted. That's the first thing someone said to me as I stepped into school. Not even a single hello or a welcome. No, I got nothing of that. At first I was a bit confused. What's haunted? I said to the kid in front of me, the one who decided to make that statement. He didn't say anything. He just turned around and started walking away. I was a bit curious now. I wonder if what that kid said was true, or if it was just some kind of prank, something to pull on the new kid. But I was very wrong. I now know. School went on for a while, and everything seemed fine. My father and mother were happy. My sister, she was happy as well. But I noticed things started to happen to me. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a heavy feeling on my chest. It was as if something was laying on top of me or pressing against my body. But when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. During those nights I swore I was being watched, as if someone was stalking me. There was this dark corner in my room that would appear every night. It was the only part of my room that was invisible during the nighttime. It was from that corner that I felt something watching me, as if someone was standing there. But I was too afraid to ever go and check. Not to mention, I was always very tired, and I tried to shrug it off and sleep, until one night, that is. As I laid in bed that night, I was having trouble sleeping as usual. That heavy feeling on my chest had returned, and it was getting hard for me to breathe. I had this feeling of overwhelming fear, but I didn't know why. It was like I was fearing for my dear life, without any reason. My eyes were open slightly, and as I gazed around the room, I swore I saw the shadows moving in the moonlight, zooming past my vision, as if they were getting closer and closer. Eventually, the shadows formed into what appeared to be a man, in a dark, long cloak. I then woke up fully. I took a deep breath, and I backed up against the wall behind my bed. But after that, I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed or something. Whatever that thing was, that man, was coming closer. It sat down on my bed, and it began to crawl towards me. I saw its dark hands press against my covers. The fingers resembled claws of some sort, but that wasn't its most terrifying feature. It had no face, no eyes. It was just darkness, a living shadow. I was panicking now. It kept coming closer and closer until it was in my face. You know, my parents always told me to pray when I felt scared, that God would answer my prayers and protect me. Well, he must have forgotten about me this time, because no amount of prayer whatsoever seemed to be helping. This thing was in my face. Its hands were reaching out, and just as it touched my face, it spoke in the deepest, darkest voice I had ever heard. I couldn't make out what it said. It was speaking in some kind of odd language, but even if it spoke English, I doubt I would have listened. I was too scared, too shaken up to pay attention. This thing spoke to me for I don't know how long, its dark, shadowy figure looming over me as it trailed its claw-like finger across my cheek, cutting into my skin slightly as some blood leaked down into my shirt. I thought this was it. I really thought I was going to die that night. However, I heard a knock at my door. I was relieved in some ways, but I was still scared that this thing was sitting on top of me, and for all I knew, it was about to eat or kill me or something. After the third knock, my mother walked into the room, and she looked over at me. She couldn't see anything. I guess she acted like I wasn't there, as if I wasn't in my room. Maybe that thing on top of me blocked her view. I really don't know, but all hope was drained from my body at that very moment. I figured this was it. I was done for. But in the blink of an eye, I saw that thing get off me. It walked back to the spot where it first formed, and it began to change. My mother had left the room by now, but I was more focused on what this thing was turning into. For a moment, it looked as if I was staring into a silhouette of myself. The creature, the man, this being, whatever it was, it then waved to me, its still dark and shadowy body fading into a black mist. I didn't stay in that room. I got up, I ran downstairs, and I slept on the couch, with every light on possible. The next morning, I awoke early, before everyone else. I packed some clothes, small food, and some extra cash that my father had left in a jar on top of the fridge. I wrote a small note detailing what happened on the counter in the kitchen. Then I left, and I never looked back. I was 17 at the time, but mentally, I felt much older. I eventually crossed state lines, going back to my home state of Texas, where I got a job as a clerk in some crappy little convenience store on the south side of Dallas. Times were tough, but I pushed through. To be honest, I had been wanting to leave home for a long time. I just needed a reason to do it. In some fucked up way, I guess what happened was that reason. But looking back, I never did hear from my family again. I sent them letters, pictures, but nothing. I never got anything back. I figured they either forgot about me, or they simply just didn't care. It wasn't until recently that I began to research on what happened that night. I had been having odd dreams lately. It seemed that this strange, heavy feeling on my chest had returned. I didn't know why, but I felt that if this thing was coming back for me, I wanted to know what it was. I then visited the local library, but I didn't find much interest. The closest I came to anything was an old Navajo legend called yenaglooshi. Apparently, it was a demonic force, or a person that would assume the shape of animals or people. It seemed logical, but I couldn't understand what such a thing would want with me. I was scared. I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, until someone I hadn't seen in a very long time showed up at my door. My mother. She was happy to see me, but she didn't seem that different since when I last saw her. Now mind you, I hadn't seen her for 25 years. I found it a bit odd that she still looked so young, but I shrugged it off. I was happy to see her. So very happy. We talked for a while, but something was off. Every time she looked at me, I got this cold feeling in my body. I felt as if I was staring at a different person. And after a while, I began to feel weak. I was tired. I hadn't slept for days. So I just went up to my room. Before that, however, my mother was telling me how my father left not long after I did, and that he took my sister with her. It was shocking, but I didn't care so much. I just wanted to sleep. But as I lay down in my bed, that feeling returned. That very same feeling I hadn't felt in 25 years. Someone is watching me from the corner of my room. I'm trying not to pay attention. I'm simply going to turn over and close my eyes. I'm not sure though if I'll make it through this night. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you do, please find my family, inform them of what happened here. The journal of John F. Moncada was found thrown in the corner of his room by police earlier this month. He was laying in his bed, calm and lifeless, when they arrived. After examining his journal, Police determined that the man had been up for a week or so before he eventually died from a heart attack. They also suspect that the man was hallucinating before he died, as the woman he claimed to be his mother was never there. In fact, she died 23 years ago in a house fire, along with the rest of his family. Strange, his bedroom window was open when the police arrived, and many neighbors claimed they saw a dark figure emerge a few nights ago. Even though there is little proof other than the witnesses' reports, the mirror in his bathroom, however, the police found many strange symbols carved into the glass, those of which were later translated from the Navajo language. There was one word, and it was burden. Police aren't sure if it holds any relevance to what happened here, but the case is now officially closed.